Marie Antoinette, the tragic rise and fall of France's last queen. Welcome to Bio Bytes, where history comes alive one incredible story at a time. Join us as we unravel the lives of the most fascinating figures in history, revealing their triumphs, tragedies, and legacies. Let's dive in. Marie Antoinette came into the world on a day steeped in both grandeur and foreboding. It was November 2nd, 1755, and in Vienna's opulent Hofburg Palace, Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, was born. Her arrival, though a joyful event in the sprawling Habsburg family, was not a moment of great celebration. She was yet another addition to a royal lineage that seemed, at the time, to offer little indication of the fame or infamy that awaited her. Her birth coincided with turbulent times in Europe. Far from Vienna, the earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of history. On the very day of her arrival, a catastrophic earthquake struck Lisbon, Portugal, flattening the city, claiming tens of thousands of lives, and leaving survivors to wonder if the heavens themselves had turned against them. These events, unconnected in their moment, would later be viewed by some as a portent of the tragic life that awaited the young archduchess. Within the confines of the Hofburg Palace, however, the world seemed far removed from such disasters. Here, surrounded by art, music, and the trappings of power, little Madame Antoine, as she was affectionately called, began her early years. She was a part of one of the most illustrious families in Europe, a dynasty whose reach and influence extended far beyond the borders of Austria. Yet, in a household bustling with 16 children, 10 of whom survived to adulthood, she was just another piece in the Habsburg Empire's intricate puzzle of diplomacy and power. Her parents had contrasting yet complementary roles. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was a towering figure, unyielding, disciplined, and deeply committed to the welfare of her family and her empire. She ruled with a firm hand, managing both her household and her vast dominions with equal vigor. Her father, Emperor Francis I, was a lighter presence, known for his charm, warmth, and love of the arts. He brought joy and a sense of play to the family, a contrast to the Empress's stern demeanor. Despite her position as one of many siblings, young Antoine enjoyed a life of relative comfort and happiness. She was closest to her sister Charlotte, 3 years her senior, and shared a particularly affectionate bond with her father, who adored her lively spirit. Her early days were filled with music, games, and family gatherings in the grand halls of the Hofburg and the gardens of Schönbrunn Palace. Vienna, a city rich in culture, was a fitting backdrop for her upbringing, as the family often gathered for concerts and theatrical performances. But even in this seemingly idyllic setting, the shadows of duty and expectation loomed large. Maria Theresa, a monarch as much as a mother, viewed each of her children as a potential asset for the Habsburg dynasty. "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry," was the family motto, and it echoed through every decision Maria Theresa made for her children. Antoine, like her siblings, was destined to play her part on the chessboard of European politics, whether she wished it or not. Her future was sealed almost from the moment of her birth. The child who would one day become Marie Antoinette was already marked for a role of historical significance, though no one, not even her formidable mother, could have foreseen just how great or how tragic that role would be. The Habsburg family was a world unto itself. Within the grand palaces of Vienna, where music echoed through gilded halls and the scent of polished wood mingled with the faint aroma of freshly arranged flowers, Marie Antoinette, then known as Madame Antoine, grew up surrounded by a sea of siblings, courtly intrigue, and the expectations of an empire. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, was an extraordinary woman. Both a mother and a monarch, she managed her family with the same precision and discipline with which she ruled her sprawling dominion. To her children, she was a formidable presence, a mix of love and duty, encouragement and criticism. She wanted them to be cultured, devout, and above all useful to the Habsburg dynasty. For Maria Theresa, love was expressed in the form of rigorous education, moral lessons, and strategic marriages. Even her warmth, when it appeared, carried an edge of expectation. Antoine's father, Emperor Francis I, was a softer figure, a man of charm and easy laughter. Where Maria Theresa represented duty and diligence, Francis brought lightness and playfulness to their family life. Though his role in the empire was largely ceremonial, his wife held the reins of power. Francis was deeply loved by his children. To young Antoine, he was the parent who would scoop her up, tease her gently, and make her laugh, providing a welcome respite from her mother's unyielding standards. Among her siblings, Antoine found herself in a bustling, complex web of relationships. She adored her sister Charlotte, who was just 3 years her senior. The two shared a bond of mischief and affection, often whispering secrets and playing games together in the quieter corners of the palace. Charlotte, with her lively personality and sharp wit, was both a companion and a role model for Antoine, a comforting presence in a world where roles were often assigned rather than chosen. Antoine also shared a special connection with her eldest brother Joseph, the future Holy Roman Emperor. Despite the significant age gap between them, Joseph's intelligence and ambition made him an inspiring figure in her young eyes. He treated her with kindness, a mix of brotherly affection and occasional teasing, and his confidence hinted at the responsibilities she would one day face as a royal. Life in the Habsburg family was filled with both joy and constraint. Even as the children enjoyed sledding in winter or riding in the summer, their days were punctuated by lessons, prayers, and the quiet, ever-present awareness of their roles in shaping the future of Europe. The family gatherings, filled with music, theater, and conversation, were moments of shared laughter and bonding, but they also carried an undercurrent of formality. Maria Theresa was not one to let sentiment cloud her judgment. She had an empire to preserve, and every child was part of her strategy. For her daughters, that meant alliances forged through marriage. The family motto, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry," was not merely a saying but a guiding principle for every decision. Antoine felt her mother's expectations keenly, even in childhood. Maria Theresa, while undoubtedly loving, could be critical of her youngest daughter. Antoine's education, particularly in academics, often failed to meet her mother's high standards. She was reprimanded for her lack of focus and urged to embrace the responsibilities of her station. These critiques, though sharp, were not meant to wound. They were her mother's way of preparing her for the harsh realities of royal life. Despite the pressure, there was love in the Habsburg household. Family dinners were lively, filled with stories and laughter, and even Maria Theresa, in her more relaxed moments, would smile as her children played. Francis I, ever the doting father, would encourage his younger children to show off their musical talents or recite the lessons they had learned. It was a life of grandeur, but also one of purpose, where every member of the family was part of a greater plan. For Antoine, these early years shaped her deeply. Her father's warmth taught her to charm and connect with others, while her mother's discipline instilled in her a sense of duty, even if she didn't always meet it with the diligence Maria Theresa hoped for. Her bond with her siblings, especially Charlotte, gave her the foundation of companionship she would later seek desperately in her new life in France. The Habsburg family was a microcosm of Europe's power and politics, but within its walls, it was also a place of relationships, laughter, and love. For Madame Antoine, these formative years were both a privilege and a preparation for the stormy path that lay ahead. Marie Antoinette's education, like much of her early life, was shaped by contrasts. On one hand, she grew up surrounded by the finest minds and cultural influences of 18th century Vienna. On the other, her academic struggles and lack of interest in scholarly pursuits often left her at odds with the expectations of her formidable mother, Empress Maria Theresa. From a young age, it was clear that Madame Antoine had a natural talent for the arts. She possessed an innate grace and charm that made her excel in pursuits like music, dance, and performance. Her musical abilities were particularly noteworthy. Under the tutelage of the famed composer Christoph Willibald Gluck, she mastered the harp and harpsichord. By adolescence, she could sight-read music with the precision of a professional, and was said to have a lovely singing voice that captivated those who heard her. Her dance instructor, Jean-Georges Noverre, one of the most celebrated ballet masters of the time, recognized her potential early. He praised her poise, elegance, and fluid movements. Dance was where Antoine shone brightest, and her natural ability earned her admiration within and beyond the palace walls. Amidst her artistic pursuits, she had one particularly memorable encounter. When she was just 6 years old, the young prodigy Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, not much older than herself, performed for the royal family at Schönbrunn Palace. Mozart, known for his precocious talent, was said to have been charmed by the little archduchess, and legend has it that he even declared his intention to marry her one day. While music and dance came effortlessly to her, academics were another matter entirely. Antoine struggled to engage with subjects like history, geography, and language. Her tutors often lamented her lack of focus and motivation, describing her as easily distracted and more inclined toward playfulness than study. By the time her French tutor, Mathieu Jacques de Vermont, arrived in 1768 to prepare her for her future role as Dauphine of France, he was appalled by her educational deficiencies. At the age of 12, Antoine could barely write in her native language, and her knowledge of French, a critical skill for her future, was rudimentary at best. De Vermont, though frustrated, noted that she was not unintelligent. On the contrary, when sufficiently motivated, she showed a remarkable ability to grasp new concepts quickly and reason through problems. He believed her struggles were more a matter of neglect than inability. Her earlier tutors had been lenient, and her privileged position in the family had allowed her to avoid the rigor imposed on some of her siblings. Despite her shortcomings in academics, Antoine's artistic talents often compensated for her deficiencies. When lessons became dull or demanding, she could charm her tutors and audiences alike with her wit and grace. Her performances at court, whether playing the harp or dancing in a family theatrical production, left lasting impressions. Her education, though uneven, reflected the values of the Habsburg court. Music, dance, and charm were seen as essential tools for diplomacy, especially for a princess whose destiny was to marry into another royal house. Maria Theresa's priority was not to create a scholar, but to mold a young woman who could enchant and negotiate in equal measure. Yet this emphasis on charm over intellect would later be a double-edged sword for Marie Antoinette. In her new role as Dauphine and later Queen of France, her lack of political knowledge and limited education would make her an easy target for criticism. But in her youth, she was simply a spirited girl who preferred the joy of music and dance to the tedium of the classroom. These early years of both triumphs and challenges would prepare her, in ways she could not yet understand, for the glittering yet turbulent future that awaited her in the courts of Versailles. Marie Antoinette's life was shaped long before she was born, not by her choices, but by the relentless tide of politics and diplomacy. Her destiny, like that of her siblings, was intertwined with the ambitions of her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, and the sprawling Habsburg Empire. It was a world where family bonds were forged as much on parchment as in the heart, sealed with signatures, treaties, and alliances rather than affection. The union between the Habsburgs of Austria and the Bourbons of France was a political maneuver, meticulously calculated to reshape the balance of power in Europe. The continent, fractured by centuries of conflict, was in a precarious state. Austria had been a central player in the War of Austrian Succession, fighting to preserve Maria Theresa's claim to the throne after the death of her father, Emperor Charles VI. Though the war ended with Maria Theresa retaining her position, Austria suffered the bitter loss of Silesia to Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of its fiercest rivals. To regain footing on the chessboard of European politics, Maria Theresa turned to diplomacy. The Austrian Empire had long been at odds with France, its traditional rival in territorial disputes and influence. But the shifting sands of alliances, spurred by Britain's alignment with Prussia, offered an opportunity for reconciliation. A new alliance between Austria and France could counterbalance their mutual enemies and create a bulwark of shared power in the heart of Europe. In this grand design, Marie Antoinette was a key piece. The betrothal of a young Habsburg princess to a Bourbon prince was not simply a marriage. It was a diplomatic statement. a gesture to signal peace, cooperation, and mutual interest. In the courtly language of the time, it was a union meant to bind the hearts of two great nations, though in reality, it was a cold calculation meant to bind their political ambitions. Antoine was just 6 months old when the idea of her marrying Louis Auguste, the future Louis XVI of France, was first proposed. At the time, the infant Dauphin was second in line to the throne, the grandson of the reigning monarch Louis XV. His position as a potential king made him an ideal candidate for a union that would bring legitimacy and continuity to the Bourbon dynasty while strengthening Austria's hand in European affairs. Years later, when the betrothal was formalized, it became a cornerstone of the 1756 Treaty of Versailles, a pact that officially ended decades of enmity between Austria and France. This treaty realigned Europe's powers, turning old enemies into allies and reshaping alliances that had dominated the continent for generations. For Maria Theresa, the stakes were personal as well as political. She believed in the strength of family ties as a means to secure peace. In her letters, she often spoke of her children as the branches of an olive tree, spreading harmony through their unions. Marie Antoinette's marriage was one of many such unions orchestrated by the Empress to create a web of Habsburg influence across Europe. The agreement to marry Antoine to Louis Auguste brought immediate benefits to both nations. For Austria, it ensured military and economic support from France, bolstering its position against Prussia and other adversaries. For France, it promised the stability of a trusted ally, an essential counterweight in the face of Britain's growing colonial and naval power. But these high expectations placed immense pressure on a young girl who, at just 14 years old, was swept up in the pomp and ceremony of a marriage with global implications. Antoine, renamed Marie Antoinette as a gesture to her new homeland, became the living embodiment of the alliance. She carried the hopes of two nations on her slight shoulders as she left Austria, her family, and her childhood behind. The marriage was celebrated with great fanfare, symbolizing not just the joining of two young lives, but the unification of two ancient dynasties. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay undercurrents of skepticism and tension. In France, whispers of distrust followed her arrival. The Austrian-born queen was seen by many as a potential spy for her homeland, her every move scrutinized for signs of betrayal. In Austria, there were fears that France might abandon its promises, or that the Bourbons, notorious for their court intrigues, might fail to honor the alliance. The marriage, while outwardly a triumph, was a fragile bridge between two nations that had been adversaries for so long. For Marie Antoinette, this alliance would define her life in ways she could never have foreseen. What began as a carefully calculated political maneuver would place her at the center of a maelstrom, one that would test not only her strength and resilience but also the very foundations of the world she was born into. The day Marie Antoinette left Austria marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. At just 14 years old, she stood at the threshold of a destiny she could barely comprehend, a future filled with glittering promise and hidden perils. But before she could take her place as Dauphine of France, she had to bid farewell to everything she had ever known. It was April of 1770, and the air was thick with both anticipation and sorrow. The procession that would carry her to France was a grand spectacle, a moving embodiment of the Habsburg-Bourbon alliance. Coaches, horses, courtiers, and attendants stretched as far as the eye could see, a display of wealth and power meant to awe and inspire. Yet, inside her carriage, the young archduchess was anything but composed. Her eyes brimmed with tears as she clung to her childhood possessions, a few trinkets, a familiar doll, the tokens of a life she would never return to. Her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, had tried to prepare her for this moment. In letters and conversations, she urged her youngest daughter to be strong, to charm the French court, and to uphold the honor of the Habsburg name. But even the Empress, so resolute in matters of state, had faltered when the time came to say goodbye. Their final embrace was a mixture of duty and heartbreak, with Maria Theresa whispering, Do so much good to the French people that they can say I sent them an angel. The journey to France was long, punctuated by grand receptions and moments of reflection. As the borders of Austria came closer, the reality of her departure began to set in. Antoine, still known by her Austrian name, was leaving not just her family but her very identity behind. The symbolic transformation took place on a small island in the middle of the Rhine River, a neutral space between the two great nations. There, in an ornate pavilion, the ritual began. She was stripped of her Austrian garments, every thread and ribbon removed as if to erase the ties to her homeland. Even her jewelry, carefully chosen by her mother, was taken away, replaced with items crafted in the French style. The act was deliberate, almost theatrical. It was meant to signify her rebirth, a shedding of the past so she could fully embrace her new role as Marie Antoinette, Dauphine of France. Yet for the young girl standing in that pavilion, it must have felt more like a loss than a transformation. When the final touch was complete, her hair styled in the intricate French fashion, her new gown fitted just so, Marie Antoinette stepped forward, ready to meet the French entourage waiting to escort her to Versailles. But as she crossed the threshold, she turned back for one fleeting moment, her gaze lingering on the land she had called home. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not let them fall. The journey from the Rhine to Versailles was filled with celebration and spectacle. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the new Dauphine, marveling at her beauty and grace. But beneath the surface of the fanfare, Marie Antoinette carried the weight of her transformation. She had left behind her language, her customs, her family, and even her name. When she finally arrived at Compiègne, she met her future husband, Louis Auguste, and his grandfather, King Louis XV. The young Dauphin was shy and awkward, his demeanor a stark contrast to the glittering expectations placed upon their union. The king, however, was charmed by her warmth and vivacity, offering her a warm welcome into the French court. That night, as she settled into her chambers, the full magnitude of her new life began to sink in. She was no longer Maria Antonia, the playful, carefree Archduchess of Austria. She was now Marie Antoinette, a symbol of unity between two of Europe's most powerful nations. The transformation was complete, but the echoes of her homeland would remain with her. In her heart, she would always carry the love of her family and the lessons of her upbringing. But from this day forward she belonged to France, for better or worse. A new chapter had begun, and the world would soon come to know her name. When Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles, it must have felt like stepping into a gilded dream. The sheer scale of the palace was overwhelming, its golden gates glinting in the sunlight, the gardens stretching endlessly, and the architecture a symphony of marble, mirrors, and opulence. Every detail, from the grand fountains to the intricately carved ceilings, seemed designed to remind all who entered that this was not merely a royal residence. It was the seat of unparalleled power. The young Dauphine, just 14, was dazzled but also intimidated. As her carriage rolled through the gates, she was greeted by a sea of courtiers, their finely powdered wigs and jewel-encrusted attire a testament to the wealth and grandeur of the French monarchy. The air was heavy with the scent of perfumed bodies and freshly arranged flowers, but beneath the sweetness, there was tension. Every gaze was assessing, every bow precise, as though the courtiers were already weighing her worth. Inside Versailles was even more astonishing. The hall of mirrors sparkled with hundreds of candles, their flames reflected infinitely in the mirrored walls. Portraits of past kings and queens gazed down from ornate frames, their silent eyes a reminder of the legacy she was expected to uphold. The palace was a living, breathing masterpiece, but it was also a maze of formality and intrigue. At first, Marie Antoinette could scarcely contain her awe. Raised in the relative privacy of the Habsburg court, she was unprepared for the sheer spectacle of Versailles. Yet, almost immediately she found herself struggling to navigate its rigid protocols. Unlike her childhood home, where there had been clear distinctions between public and private life, Versailles offered no such respite. Every moment, every action was on display. Even the most personal rituals were public affairs. Dressing in the morning was a ceremonial event, attended by ladies-in-waiting, courtiers, and even visitors of high rank. The layers of etiquette were dizzying. Who handed her a handkerchief, who opened a door, who adjusted her gown. All of these tasks were governed by rank and privilege, often resulting in awkward pauses and tense silences as precedence was determined. It wasn't just the lack of privacy that unsettled her. The court was a web of alliances and rivalries, with whispers in every corner and ambitions behind every smile. As the new Dauphine, she was both a symbol of hope and a target of scrutiny. Some courtiers welcomed her with warmth, eager to align themselves with the future queen. Others, wary of her Austrian heritage, eyed her with suspicion. Among her greatest challenges was her relationship with Madame du Barry, the king's mistress. Du Barry was a powerful figure at court, and though Louis XV had taken an immediate liking to Marie Antoinette, the young Dauphine refused to acknowledge his mistress. This subtle act of defiance quickly became a source of tension, drawing lines in the sand among the courtiers and further complicating her already precarious position. Adapting to the life of Versailles was no small feat. Marie Antoinette had to learn not only the intricate etiquette, but also how to wield charm and grace as tools of survival. Slowly, she began to find her footing, winning admiration for her beauty, her musical talents, and her lively personality. Yet beneath the surface she struggled with loneliness and homesickness. The isolation of being constantly observed, of having no private moments to mourn her family or adjust to her new life, weighed heavily on her. Letters to her mother reflected her inner turmoil. She tried to project confidence and success, but her words often betrayed her vulnerability. Versailles, for all its splendor, was not a sanctuary, it was a stage. And on this stage, every gesture, every word, every glance was subject to judgment. For the young Dauphine, the transition from the sheltered world of Vienna to the glittering but treacherous court of France was as much a test of endurance as it was of charm. This was the world she had entered, a place where beauty masked ambition, where alliances were as fleeting as the seasons, and where the golden walls of Versailles held secrets as old as the monarchy itself. Marie Antoinette had arrived, but the question remained. Would she thrive in this world of grandeur and intrigue, or would it consume her? Marie Antoinette's marriage to Louis Auguste was meant to be the cornerstone of a powerful alliance between Austria and France. But from the very beginning, their union was marked by tension, confusion, and frustration, as two young and inexperienced individuals struggled to navigate the expectations of monarchy, marriage, and each other. The Dauphin, just 15 at the time of their wedding, was an enigma to his new bride. Tall and awkward, he was shy to the point of timidity, a stark contrast to Marie Antoinette's vivacious energy and charm. He preferred quiet pursuits, spending hours hunting or tinkering with locks and keys, while she thrived on music, dancing, and the lively social whirl of Versailles. Their differences were apparent almost immediately, not only to each other but to the ever-watchful eyes of the court. For Marie Antoinette, who had been raised to view marriage as both a duty and a source of companionship, the lack of physical and emotional intimacy was baffling. Nights passed without so much as a word between them. Despite sharing a bed, Louis Auguste seemed almost oblivious to the expectations placed upon their union. The unconsummated marriage quickly became the subject of gossip and speculation at court. Versailles, with its complete lack of privacy, was a breeding ground for rumors, and the Dauphin's reluctance became public knowledge within days. Courtiers whispered about his awkwardness, his disinterest, and even his potential inadequacies. Marie Antoinette, barely more than a child herself, bore the brunt of this humiliation, as her failure to produce an heir began to tarnish her reputation. The French people, who initially embraced their new Dauphine with warmth and admiration, grew increasingly critical as years passed without the announcement of a royal child. In an era when queens were judged almost exclusively by their ability to secure the line of succession, her perceived failure was seen as both a personal flaw and a betrayal of her role. Her Austrian heritage made matters worse. Detractors at court and in the streets suggested that she was intentionally withholding herself to sabotage the French monarchy in favor of Austrian interests. Others painted her as frivolous and unworthy, spending her days in excess and neglecting her responsibilities. Behind closed doors, the reality was far more complex. Louis Auguste's reluctance was not due to any lack of affection or interest in his young wife. Historians now believe his hesitance stemmed from a combination of extreme shyness, ignorance, and anxiety. Raised in an environment where frank discussions of intimacy were taboo, he may have lacked the understanding or confidence to take the necessary steps. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette felt increasingly isolated. Her letters to her mother reveal her growing despair and confusion as she struggled to understand her husband's distance and navigate the mounting pressure from the court. Maria Theresa's responses, sharp and unsparing, urged her daughter to take responsibility for resolving the situation, further adding to her feelings of inadequacy. The turning point came in 1777, 7 years into their marriage, when her brother, Emperor Joseph II, visited France. Joseph, pragmatic and direct, took it upon himself to mediate between the young couple. In private discussions with Louis, he offered advice and reassurance, addressing the Dauphin's anxieties with a clarity that no one else had dared. Within weeks of Joseph's intervention, the marriage was finally consummated. Marie Antoinette's relief was palpable, and she wasted no time in writing to her mother to share the news. "At last," she wrote, "everything is as it should be. I hope soon to bring you happier tidings still." Her hope was fulfilled the following year, with the birth of her first child, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. The arrival of a daughter marked the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship, one defined by a growing bond between husband and wife. Though their marriage would never be a passionate love story, it evolved into a partnership of mutual respect and shared duty. Yet the damage to their public reputation was not so easily repaired. The years of gossip had left a lasting stain, and even as the royal couple began to fulfill their roles as parents, whispers of their earlier failures continued to echo through Versailles and beyond. For Louis Auguste and Marie Antoinette, their marriage was more than a private relationship. It was a symbol of the French monarchy itself. And while they had taken steps to strengthen their bond, the cracks exposed during those early years would never fully disappear, casting a long shadow over their reign and their legacy. When Marie Antoinette ascended to the throne of France at just 19 years old, she entered a world of dazzling power and limitless indulgence. As queen, she was at the pinnacle of French society, a figure of beauty and influence whose every move was scrutinized and emulated. Yet, in these early years of her reign, the allure of opulence and the pursuit of personal freedom would set the stage for her downfall. Marie Antoinette was no stranger to luxury, but Versailles elevated extravagance to an art form. She was captivated by the splendor of court life. The glittering chandeliers, the endless balls, the sumptuous gowns adorned with jewels and lace. It was a world where appearances mattered above all else, and where the queen, young and striking, was expected to embody the grandeur of the French monarchy. Her passion for fashion quickly became a defining trait. Every season, new designs were commissioned, each gown more elaborate than the last. Her towering wigs, often adorned with feathers, flowers, or even miniature ships, became the talk of Europe, setting trends that aristocrats scrambled to follow. Parisian dressmakers thrived on her patronage, and her influence over French style was so profound that she was dubbed the Queen of Fashion. But the Queen's extravagant tastes extended far beyond clothing. She was known for hosting lavish parties and gambling at the royal gaming tables late into the night. She spared no expense on her private estate, the Petit Trianon, where she created a rustic fantasy world, complete with a faux peasant village and a carefully manicured farm. Here, she and her friends played at simplicity, dressed in flowing muslin gowns and pretended to be shepherdesses, far removed from the harsh realities of French society. For a time, these indulgences were seen as harmless, even charming. The French court admired her beauty and grace, and many aristocrats sought her favor through gifts and flattery. But outside the gilded walls of Versailles, public opinion began to shift. France was in crisis, its treasury drained by wars and mismanagement. The peasants struggled under the weight of high taxes and poor harvests, while the burgeoning middle class resented the privileges of the aristocracy. Against this backdrop of hardship, the Queen's extravagance became a lightning rod for criticism. Pamphlets and gossip painted her as a frivolous and wasteful figure, a woman disconnected from the suffering of her people. She was accused of spending millions on jewels and dresses while bread prices soared. Satirical cartoons depicted her as a gluttonous harpy, feasting while her subjects starved. The Petit Trianon, meant to be her sanctuary, became a symbol of her perceived indifference. The sight of the Queen playing at being a milkmaid, surrounded by artificial rusticity, only fueled the perception that she mocked the struggles of real farmers and laborers. Her Austrian heritage also made her an easy target. Nicknamed the Austrian Woman, she was viewed by many as an outsider with divided loyalties. Whispers of political meddling and secret correspondence with Vienna began to circulate, further damaging her reputation. As the criticisms mounted, Marie Antoinette found herself increasingly isolated. She withdrew from the public eye, retreating into the carefully controlled world of her close circle of friends and confidants. But this only deepened the divide between her and her people, who began to see her as distant, arrogant, and out of touch. Her love of fashion, once celebrated, became a tool for ridicule. Each new gown or accessory was seen not as a statement of elegance, but as proof of her excess. Even the infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," though likely never uttered by her, became forever associated with her name, a symbol of her supposed apathy toward the plight of the poor. Marie Antoinette's early years as queen were a paradox. She was both adored and despised, admired for her beauty and charm, yet reviled for her perceived extravagance. The very qualities that had once captivated the court and the people of France now became the foundation of their resentment. As the years went on, the weight of public opinion would press ever harder on her shoulders. What had begun as a fascination with luxury and freedom would evolve into a desperate struggle to protect her family, her crown, and her legacy. And in the end, the Queen's love for beauty and pleasure would be remembered not as a celebration of life, but as a fatal flaw, misunderstood and magnified by a world on the brink of revolution. The births of Marie Antoinette's children marked a profound turning point in her life. After years of scrutiny and pressure to produce an heir, the arrival of her first child, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, in December 1778 was a moment of immense joy and relief. The long-awaited consummation of her marriage and the subsequent birth of her daughter silenced some of the court gossip, at least for a time. For the Queen, motherhood brought both purpose and a deep emotional fulfillment she had long sought. Marie Antoinette was a devoted mother. Her letters reveal a tenderness and a protectiveness that stood in contrast to the cold and formal relationships common among royal families of the time. She delighted in spending time with her children, overseeing their education and ensuring their well-being. The birth of her first son, Louis Joseph, in 1781, seemed to secure her position further, as he was the long-anticipated Dauphin, the direct heir to the throne. These moments of joy, however, came with new challenges. Motherhood gave her a reprieve from the relentless social obligations of Versailles, but it also amplified her desire to shield her children from the stifling formalities and intrigues of court life. The birth of two more children, Louis Charles in 1785 and Sophie Hélène in 1786, only deepened this longing. Her solution was the Petit Trianon, a secluded estate nestled within the grounds of Versailles. Originally built for Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, the Petit Trianon was gifted to Marie Antoinette by her husband as a private retreat. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the rigid protocols of court and embrace a simpler, more intimate lifestyle. At the Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette was free to create a world of her own design. She transformed the estate into a pastoral idyll, commissioning the construction of a charming hamlet complete with cottages, a dairy, and a working farm. It was a whimsical version of rural life, carefully curated and idealized. Here, she and her children could play and explore without the watchful eyes of courtiers. The queen often dressed in flowing muslin gowns, her hair adorned with wildflowers, eschewing the extravagant attire that had once defined her public image. She hosted small gatherings of close friends, where laughter replaced the calculated politeness of Versailles. Music, games, and picnics were the order of the day, a sharp contrast to the rigid grandeur of court life. But while the Petit Trianon offered Marie Antoinette a refuge, it also became a symbol of her growing detachment from the French people. To her critics, the queen's rustic retreat was not a haven, but an insult. The sight of her playing at being a shepherdess, surrounded by luxury disguised as simplicity, seemed to mock the harsh realities of life for the struggling peasants outside the palace gates. The queen's intentions were likely innocent. She sought peace and privacy, not mockery or malice. Yet the optics were disastrous. The Petit Trianon, meant to be a retreat from the pressures of her role, became a focal point of public resentment. As her children grew, so too did the demands on her as queen. But her time at the Petit Trianon remained precious to her. It was there that she could be simply a mother, away from the weight of politics and expectations, even if only for a few fleeting moments. Motherhood brought out the most tender and human side of Marie Antoinette. It gave her a purpose beyond the courtly pageantry and deepened her connections to those she loved most. Yet, in the volatile climate of pre-revolutionary France, even this part of her life was twisted into a narrative of excess and neglect. The queen who once dazzled Versailles with her fashion and charm was now increasingly seen as aloof, detached from her people, and out of touch with the world beyond the palace walls. Her children and her Petit Trianon were her solace, but they were also her vulnerability, for as revolution loomed on the horizon, it would be her role as a mother that both defined her humanity and sealed her fate. The affair of the diamond necklace was a scandal that would forever haunt Marie Antoinette, tarnishing her reputation and fueling the growing discontent of the French people. Though she had no part in the scheme, the story was woven so tightly with her image that it became one of the most damaging episodes of her life. The necklace itself was a marvel of craftsmanship. Created by jewelers Baumer and Bassange, it was a masterpiece of opulence, adorned with 647 diamonds and valued at an astronomical price. Originally commissioned for Madame du Barry, the former mistress of Louis XV, the necklace remained unsold after the king's death, as no one else dared flaunt such extravagance. Years later, the jewelers approached Marie Antoinette, hoping she might purchase the piece. The queen admired the necklace, but refused. France was already struggling financially, and she knew such a purchase would be seen as indulgent in a time of widespread hardship. What followed was a web of deception, greed, and ambition. Jeanne de la Motte, a clever and unscrupulous con artist, devised a scheme to acquire the necklace by exploiting the queen's name and reputation. Jeanne claimed to be a confidant of Marie Antoinette, a falsehood that lent her considerable influence among those eager to curry favor with the royal court. She ensnared Cardinal Rohan, a high-ranking clergyman desperate to regain the queen's favor. Jeanne convinced him that Marie Antoinette secretly wished to purchase the necklace, but could not do so publicly due to the strained economy. Through forged letters, Jeanne persuaded Rohan to act as an intermediary, claiming he would win the queen's gratitude by securing the transaction on her behalf. To seal the deception, Jeanne arranged a clandestine meeting. A woman resembling Marie Antoinette, later revealed to be a prostitute hired for the role, met Rohan at night in the palace gardens. This brief encounter convinced the cardinal that the queen was indeed behind the scheme. Blinded by ambition and naivety, Rohan agreed to purchase the necklace, promising to pay the jewelers in installments. Jean and her accomplices promptly disappeared with the necklace, breaking it apart and selling the diamonds across Europe. When the payments were due, the truth began to unravel. The jewelers approached the queen, demanding payment, only to be met with confusion and indignation. Furious at the affront to her name, Marie Antoinette insisted on an investigation, determined to clear her reputation. What followed was a highly public trial that captivated France. Cardinal Rohan, Jean de la Motte, and several accomplices were arrested and brought before the Parlement of Paris. The proceedings became a spectacle, feeding the public's appetite for scandal and intrigue. Despite overwhelming evidence of his gullibility, Rohan was acquitted, likely due to his high social standing and the Parlement's disdain for the monarchy. Jean, however, was convicted and sentenced to public whipping and imprisonment, though she managed to escape and spent the rest of her life spreading lies about the queen. For Marie Antoinette, the damage was done. Although she had no involvement in the affair, the public perception of her as frivolous, manipulative, and out of touch deepened. Pamphlets and cartoons portrayed her as a scheming, greedy woman who would stop at nothing to indulge her desires, even at the expense of the nation. The affair crystallized the growing resentment toward the queen and the monarchy. It reinforced the narrative that Marie Antoinette was the root of France's woes, a symbol of decadence and excess in an age of widespread suffering. The infamous line, "Let them eat cake," though never spoken by her, became irrevocably tied to her image, cementing her role as the villain in the eyes of many. In reality, the diamond necklace affair was a tragedy of misunderstanding and exploitation, but its consequences were far-reaching. It eroded the remaining goodwill toward the queen and added fuel to the revolutionary fires already smoldering across France. For Marie Antoinette, it was not just an attack on her reputation, it was a harbinger of the storm that would soon engulf her and the monarchy she represented. As the 1780s drew to a close, the Kingdom of France teetered on the edge of an abyss. Decades of lavish spending, costly wars, and poor harvests had pushed the nation into financial ruin. Bread prices soared and famine stalked the countryside. For the ordinary people of France, life became a desperate struggle to survive. At the heart of this storm was a government crippled by debt and incapable of reform. The tax system was hopelessly outdated, burdening the poorest citizens while exempting the clergy and the nobility, who owned most of the wealth. Efforts to reform the system had repeatedly failed, blocked by the entrenched privilege of the aristocracy. By 1788, the situation had become untenable. The treasury was empty, the streets of Paris were restless, and calls for change grew louder with each passing day. King Louis XVI, under immense pressure, made a decision that had not been taken in over a century and a half. He summoned the Estates General. The Estates General was a gathering of representatives from France's three traditional social orders: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners. It was intended to provide advice to the king and propose solutions to the kingdom's dire problems. But the meeting, held in May 1789, quickly revealed the deep fractures within French society. The Third Estate, representing the commoners, was determined to bring about meaningful change. They demanded fair representation and an end to the privileges enjoyed by the first two estates. Yet, their voices were stifled, and their grievances dismissed by the nobles and clergy, who clung fiercely to their traditional power. Frustrated, the Third Estate took a bold step. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly, vowing to create a constitution that would reflect the will of the people. Days later, locked out of their meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore the famous tennis court oath, promising not to disband until their goals were achieved. This defiance marked a turning point. The old order was crumbling, and the king's authority was openly challenged for the first time. Meanwhile, the streets of Paris were seething with unrest. Hunger and despair turned to anger, and rumors of royal troops massing to crush the National Assembly only heightened tensions. On July 14, 1789, the storm broke. A massive crowd gathered in Paris, their focus fixed on the Bastille, an ancient fortress that loomed as a symbol of royal tyranny. They sought weapons and gunpowder to defend themselves against the king's soldiers, but the Bastille's real significance was far greater than its arsenal. As the mob surged forward, chaos erupted. Shots were fired, and blood stained the cobblestones. The fortress was overwhelmed, its governor captured and brutally executed by the enraged crowd. The storming of the Bastille was not just a victory for the people, it was a message to the monarchy. The authority of the crown had been shattered, and a new force, the will of the people, had risen to take its place. When news of the Bastille's fall reached Versailles, it sent shockwaves through the royal court. Louis XVI, upon being informed, asked, "Is it a revolt?" The response was chilling. "No, sire, it is a revolution." The storming of the Bastille marked the beginning of a seismic shift in France. The revolution was no longer a whisper of discontent, it had become a roar. The monarchy was under siege, and the ancient regime that had ruled for centuries was on the brink of collapse. For Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the events of July 1789 were the harbinger of a long and grueling battle for survival. The world they had known, a world of grandeur and privilege, was crumbling around them. And as the revolution gained momentum, the monarchy would find itself powerless to stop the tide of change sweeping across France. By the summer of 1791, the French monarchy was unraveling. The revolution had stripped Louis XVI of much of his power, and the royal family found themselves prisoners in all but name, confined to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. The king, indecisive and deeply uneasy with the changes unfolding around him, struggled to find a path forward. Beside him, Marie Antoinette worked tirelessly, secretly corresponding with monarchist allies abroad, urging them to intervene and restore the old order. But as the months passed, it became clear that remaining in Paris was becoming increasingly dangerous. The once loyal subjects now viewed the royal family with suspicion, and the streets were filled with angry crowds demanding justice, reform, and increasingly, the end of monarchy itself. It was Marie Antoinette who took the lead in planning their escape. Late at night on June 20th, 1791, the family quietly slipped out of the Tuileries, dressed in disguises. Louis, ever the simple and cautious man, donned the clothes of a valet, while Marie Antoinette, her children and their governess, assumed the roles of bourgeois travelers. They climbed into a waiting carriage, a heavy vehicle ill-suited for speed, and began their desperate journey toward Montmédy, near the Austrian border, where royalist forces awaited to shelter them. For the first few hours, the plan unfolded as hoped. They passed through the darkened countryside, the children sleeping peacefully, and Marie Antoinette whispering reassurances to her husband. But the escape was doomed from the start. The royal family's departure had not gone unnoticed. In their absence, a servant discovered the empty chambers at the Tuileries, and alarm bells spread through Paris. The National Guard was quickly mobilized, and patrols scoured the countryside for any sign of the fleeing royals. As dawn broke, their carriage rumbled into the town of Varennes. It was here, amidst the quiet streets and the watchful eyes of locals, that the king's identity was betrayed. A postmaster, having glimpsed Louis XVI's face on a coin, recognized him instantly. The alarm was raised and the family's carriage was surrounded. At first, Louis attempted to maintain the charade, insisting they were ordinary travelers. But the weight of suspicion was too great, and the crowd's growing hostility left no room for escape. The royal family was arrested, their desperate bid for freedom cut short. The journey back to Paris was a humiliation. The once revered monarchs were paraded before jeering crowds, their carriage crawling through streets thick with rage and derision. Marie Antoinette sat stiffly, her face pale, her composure barely masking her devastation. The children clung to her, frightened and confused, while Louis sat in silent resignation. When they arrived at the Tuileries, it was no longer a palace but a prison. The failed escape shattered whatever remained of the public's faith in the monarchy. To many, this was proof of the king's betrayal, evidence that he had sought to abandon his people to foreign invaders. For Louis and Marie Antoinette, the dream of rescue, of returning to power, was all but extinguished. They were no longer symbols of stability or leadership. They were now captives of a revolution that would not stop until it had torn down the very foundations of their world. In the months that followed, their confinement grew tighter, their isolation more profound. The king's authority continued to erode, while revolutionary fervor swept through France like a wildfire. The flight to Varennes, meant to secure their safety, had instead sealed their fate. And as the walls of their gilded prison closed in, the royal family could only wait, powerless against the tide of history that now surged against them. The year 1792 marked the beginning of the end for Louis XVI. The revolution, now in full force, had cast aside any illusions of compromise with the monarchy. The once revered king, now stripped of his titles and known as Citizen Louis Capet, found himself standing before a nation that no longer wanted him. His trial began in December, conducted by the National Convention. The charges were severe: treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, and betrayal of the revolution. Evidence was presented, some of it forged, but much of it undeniable. The discovery of documents in a hidden iron chest at the Tuileries Palace revealed Louis's secret communications with foreign monarchies, further damning his case. Throughout the proceedings, Louis maintained his composure, speaking with dignity and restraint. He defended his actions not as betrayals but as attempts to safeguard his people and kingdom. Yet the convention's decision seemed inevitable. On January 15, 1793, the Assembly voted on the king's fate. The outcome was stark. By a narrow margin, Louis was sentenced to death. The once unthinkable had become reality. France's king was to be executed. The night before his death, Louis spent his final hours in prayer, saying farewell to his family. Marie Antoinette clung to him, their children weeping at their side. The scene was heartrending, but the king held firm, comforting them with quiet strength. On the morning of January 21, 1793, Louis was escorted to the Place de la Révolution. The streets were lined with somber, watchful crowds. Some jeered, but many stood silent, their faces betraying a mixture of anger, grief, and disbelief. The king mounted the scaffold with calm resolve. Addressing the crowd, he declared his innocence and prayed for France. Moments later, the blade of the guillotine fell, and with it, the monarchy was no more. For Marie Antoinette, the loss of her husband was a devastating blow. She had already endured so much: the betrayal of the court, the collapse of the monarchy, the imprisonment of her family. But now she was alone, the sole protector of her children. In the months following Louis's execution, she faced increasing isolation. The Dauphin, her son Louis Charles, was seen as a potential rallying point for monarchist forces. Revolutionary leaders separated him from his mother, subjecting the young boy to unspeakable neglect and abuse, in a bid to erase his royal identity. Marie Antoinette's own imprisonment became harsher, her living conditions more squalid. Yet she remained resolute. Letters smuggled from her cell reveal a woman determined to endure, focused on her children and her faith. Her defiance, however, came at a cost. The revolution's leaders viewed her as a dangerous symbol of the old regime, a focal point for counter-revolutionary hopes. The decision was made to bring her to trial. Her trial, held in October 1793, was a mockery of justice. The charges ranged from conspiracy with foreign powers to extravagance and moral corruption. Most damning and utterly fabricated was the accusation of incest with her own son, a claim that horrified even her detractors. When asked why she did not respond to the vile accusation, she famously declared, "I appeal to all mothers here." Her words cut through the courtroom, silencing even her harshest critics for a moment. But the outcome was predetermined. On October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette was sentenced to death. That morning, she dressed in a plain white gown, her once luxurious hair shorn to the scalp. As she was led through the streets of Paris in an open cart, the crowds jeered, but she held her head high. Her dignity remained intact, even as she approached the scaffold. Standing before the guillotine, she made a final apology to the executioner, having accidentally stepped on his foot. Her last words, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it," were a testament to her grace, even in her final moments. The blade fell, and with it the life of one of history's most polarizing figures. Marie Antoinette's death marked the end of an era, but it was not the end of her story. She became a symbol, a warning of excess to some, a martyr to others. Her legacy, like her life, remains a subject of fascination, debate, and reflection. Even in her final days, she showed a strength that defied her critics, a resilience forged through unimaginable trials. And though the revolution sought to erase her, her name endures, a haunting reminder of a world forever changed. By the autumn of 1793, Marie Antoinette's world had narrowed to the cold, damp walls of the Conciergerie, a fortress-turned-prison in the heart of Paris. Once the queen of one of the most opulent courts in Europe, she was now a lonely prisoner, bereft of her family and awaiting her fate. Her trial began on October 14th, a spectacle crafted not for justice, but for public condemnation. The charges against her were sweeping and severe: conspiracy with Austria, squandering France's treasury, and influencing her husband's decisions to undermine the revolution. Yet the accusations did not stop at the political or financial. In their desperation to blacken her name, the prosecution introduced shocking and salacious charges. They accused her of incest with her young son, Louis Charles, who had been separated from her and cruelly manipulated into making false statements against his mother. When confronted with this vile accusation, Marie Antoinette's response was not one of anger, but of profound sorrow. Rising from her seat, her voice steady yet heavy with emotion, she said, "I appeal to all mothers here. Could you imagine such a crime?" Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade, silencing even her harshest critics for a moment. Despite her composure and the lack of credible evidence, the outcome was never in doubt. The Revolutionary Tribunal had no intention of sparing her. 2 days later, she was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. On the morning of October 16, 1793, Marie Antoinette prepared herself for the final journey. She donned a simple white dress, her once famous hair now shorn short, and her face pale but serene. She declined the services of a priest, preferring to face her end with quiet dignity and resolve. Led through the streets of Paris in an open cart, she endured the jeers and insults of the crowd without flinching. The same people who once cheered her as a young bride now hurled hatred at her, yet she remained composed, her gaze fixed ahead. Arriving at the Place de la Révolution, she climbed the steps to the guillotine with calm determination. In her final moments, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words, spoken softly but clearly, were, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." As the blade fell, the crowd roared, but a strange silence followed. The spectacle was over, yet the image of the queen, dignified even in death, lingered. Marie Antoinette's final days were a testament to her inner strength. She faced the relentless hatred of a nation, the betrayal of her people, and the cruel separation from her children with a grace that defied her circumstances. Her trial had been a farce, a grotesque performance aimed at vilifying her rather than uncovering truth. Yet in those dark, final days, Marie Antoinette showed a quiet resilience that left even her enemies with a grudging respect. Her death marked the end of an era, but it also solidified her place in history, not just as a queen, but as a woman who met her fate with extraordinary dignity. Through the hatred and lies, through the shouts of the crowd, her legacy endures, reminding us of the fragile line between power and tragedy. Marie Antoinette's story did not end with the fall of the guillotine. Her legacy, tangled in myths, propaganda, and historical reinterpretation, remains one of the most debated in history. During her lifetime, she was painted as the embodiment of royal excess, The scandalous libels or gossip pamphlets that circulated through Paris portrayed her as a spendthrift, a manipulator, and even a debauched seductress. Her nickname, Madame Deficit, became a rallying cry for a nation on the brink of revolution, blaming her for France's financial woes. The truth, however, was far more complex. While Marie Antoinette lived extravagantly by any standard, she was no more lavish than any other European monarch of the time. In fact, much of the public ire directed at her spending ignored the far larger debts incurred by years of warfare and poor fiscal management under previous reigns. The infamous phrase, "let them eat cake," so often attributed to her, was likely never spoken by her at all. This line, used to illustrate her supposed indifference to the suffering of the poor, had appeared in literature decades before her time. Yet it became part of the caricature of Marie Antoinette, the queen who could not understand her people. In her final years, the revolution transformed her from a symbol of excess to a scapegoat. She was no longer a queen, but a prisoner, no longer a powerful figure, but a mother grieving the loss of her children and her husband. Her trial and execution were not acts of justice, but performances meant to satisfy the revolution's thirst for retribution. As the years passed, her image began to shift. Historians started to peel back the layers of propaganda to uncover the human being beneath the crown. They found a young woman thrust into an impossible role at just 14, navigating a foreign court, a distant husband, and the pressures of being a political pawn. Modern reinterpretations have cast her as a tragic figure, a woman of grace and charm, whose missteps and extravagances were magnified by the storm of revolution around her. Her love for her children, her dedication to her husband despite their challenges, and her resolve in facing death have humanized her in ways that her contemporaries could not. Perhaps her greatest tragedy was being born into a world on the brink of transformation. The French monarchy, steeped in centuries of absolute rule, was unsuited for the revolutionary fervor of the 18th century. Marie Antoinette was not a reformer, nor was she prepared to lead in a time of crisis. But neither was she the villain that history painted her to be for so long. Her story serves as a cautionary tale of power and perception, of how public opinion, once turned, can destroy even the most carefully cultivated image, and of how history can be shaped as much by those who tell it as by those who live it. Today, Marie Antoinette is remembered not just as a queen, but as a woman caught in the tides of history, a symbol of both the excesses of monarchy and the human cost of revolution. Her legacy invites us to look beyond the myths and see her for what she truly was, a flawed, fascinating, and ultimately tragic figure, whose life and death still echo through the centuries. And that wraps up today's journey through history. Thank you for joining us as we explored the remarkable life and legacy of Marie Antoinette. Here at Bio Bytes, we're passionate about uncovering the stories behind the names, diving deep into the people who shaped our world, and challenging the myths we thought we knew. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into history's most fascinating lives. What do you think about Marie Antoinette, a misunderstood queen or a symbol of the old regime's excess? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, history is more than dates and events. It's about people, just like us, who lived, dreamed, and left their mark on the world. Thanks for watching Bio Bytes, and we'll see you in the next one.